FBI Director Christopher Wray says Russia is trying to influence a 2020 election again. Here's what Wray said during a House hearing on Homeland Security today.
The intelligence community's consensus is that Russia continues to try to influence our elections, primarily through what we would call malign foreign influence, as opposed to what we saw in 2016, where there was also an effort to target election infrastructure, cyber targeting. We have not seen that second part yet this year or this cycle.
NBC News correspondent Leigh Caldwell joins me now. Leigh, any more detail on what Russia might be doing?
Well, that second part that he was talking to that Russia isn't doing is talking about trying to hack in to election systems in states across the country. We heard over and over again after the 2016 election that that was the biggest thing that Russia attempted to do. They didn't have a lot of success at the time. But this time, Gotti, they are engaging in very deep and sophisticated misinformation campaigns on trying to divide the country by ideology, spreading conspiracy theories, those sorts of things that cause people to question what is happening, especially at the presidential level and especially on cultural issues as well. They said that Russia is also trying to harm Joe Biden in those respects as well. And so Russia has not stepped aside for this election, even though the United States has done a decent job of trying to secure the election system as a whole. But as far as this disinformation component, has a lot of work to do, Gotti.
And Wray was also asked whether the FBI is investigating Antifa. How does the FBI see Antifa versus the Trump administration?
Well, the FBI Director Wray, he did say that Antifa is a real thing, but he says it's not a coalition. It's more of a movement, individuals with this ideology about it. He did offer some caution and a little bit of concern about it. But he also mentioned other groups as well, including the Boogaloo movement, which is tends to be a right-wing movement that works in conspiracy theories. And he says that their goal is to destroy the American government. So, he said that these things, these movements, groups of people, as far as the Boogaloo movement is concerned, are real, and they are popping up and showing themselves, especially in these protests that are happening across the country. He also said that there is some concern about groups of people there's increased chatter about people who do want to harm police. So he did issue some warning there, but he had big words of caution, Gotti, that this is a thing that is persisting and it's not going to go away anytime soon.
And Leigh, yesterday we heard the CDC director say that masks may ultimately protect us more than a coronavirus vaccine. The president later said he was confused. What are lawmakers on Capitol Hill saying about this public disagreement between the president and the CDC?
Well, Democrats are beside themselves. They are saying that once again, the president is putting his own political interests ahead of science. As far as Republicans are concerned, they are tending to take the side of the president. I asked the Republican leader of the House today who he believes, Dr. Redfield or the president. Let's take a listen, hear what he had to say.
If I just take the words of the CDC and the president is right. You say Redstone said one thing, the president said the other. What I think has happened here, because of Operation Warp Speed, things are moving so quickly that we are able to do things that we haven't done before, but making sure we test every ability of going forward so it's safe and it's effective. I think one of those two individuals had more information than the other, and that was the president.
Leader McCarthy is a very close ally of the president. He has been for quite some time, talks to the president almost on a daily basis. But I will say, Gotti, I was a little surprised when I first asked the question. I thought that he was going to talk around it and not answer specifically so directly that he trusts the president over Dr. Redfield when it comes to these issues. But there you go. He did say it. And, you know, this is obviously a political issue. We're 6.5 weeks away from Election Day. And Leader McCarthy's answer completely proves it. Scotty.
Yeah, no mincing of words there at all. Thanks so much, Leanne.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.